Clint Eastwood found his father's last letter 30 years after the old man died. Found it by accident while cleaning out his childhood home, preparing to sell it. The envelope was yellowed with age, tucked inside an old book his father had loved, addressed to him in his father's distinctive handwriting. A letter written just days before his death. A letter Clint had never known existed. He almost didn't open it. Almost threw it away with the other remnants of a past he'd spent 3 decades trying to move beyond. But something made him stop. Made him sit down on the dusty floor of his father's old study. Made him open the envelope with trembling hands. What he read destroyed him. Not because it was cruel, not because it was angry, but because it was everything he'd needed to hear 30 years ago. Everything that might have changed their relationship. Everything that might have healed the wounds they'd both carried. And he was reading it 3 decades too late. This is the story of that letter, how it came to be hidden, what it said, and why sometimes the words we need most come when we can no longer respond to them. To understand what the letter meant, you need to know about Clint's relationship with his father. Clint Eastwood and his father had been complicated. That's the word people used. Complicated, like it was a polite way to say broken, distant, filled with unspoken resentments and unmet expectations. His father had been a working man, blue-collar, tough, from a generation that didn't talk about feelings, didn't hug, didn't say I love you out loud, showed love through provision, through showing up to work every day, through keeping a roof over the family's head and food on the table. Clint had wanted more, wanted approval, wanted to hear that his father was proud of him, wanted some sign that he mattered beyond being another mouth to feed. Another responsibility to shoulder. When Clint had told his father he wanted to be an actor, wanted to go to Hollywood, instead of getting a real job, the old man had been furious. Not loud, angry, quiet angry, the worst kind. The kind that built walls instead of bridges. You're going to waste your life chasing a fantasy, his father had said. You're going to end up broke and disappointed. And don't come crawling back to me when it all falls apart. Clint had gone anyway. Stubborn, determined, and he'd made it, had become successful beyond anyone's expectations, but success hadn't bridged the gap with his father. If anything, it widened it, because now Clint had proven the old man wrong, and his father couldn't admit it, couldn't say, I was wrong, you made it, I'm proud of you. They'd seen each other over the years. Holidays, obligatory visits, conversations about weather and sports, and nothing that mattered. Clint waiting for his father to acknowledge his success, his father waiting for what? Clint never knew. Then his father got sick. Lung cancer, decades of smoking finally catching up. 3 months from diagnosis to death. Fast and brutal. Clint had visited near the end, sat by the hospital bed, tried to have the conversation they'd never had, tried to break through the walls, but his father was too weak, too medicated, too close to death. And the words that needed saying stayed locked inside both of them. His father died on a Tuesday morning. Clint wasn't there, had gone home to shower and change clothes, had missed the moment by 20 minutes, one more regret to add to the pile. The funeral was dignified, respectful. People said nice things, talked about what a hard worker he'd been, what a provider, what a man of his generation. But Clint sat there numb, grieving not just the father he'd lost, but the relationship they'd never had. After the funeral, Clint had avoided dealing with his father's house, let it sit, paid the utilities, kept the lawn mowed, but couldn't bring himself to go through the old man's things, to face the emptiness of it all. That avoidance lasted 30 years. 3 decades later, Clint was 94. His father had died when Clint was in his 60s, and finally it was time. The house had to be sold. Clint's health was declining. His own children were insisting. The old place had sat empty long enough. It was time to let go, move on, close that chapter finally. Clint had hired a company to handle most of it, estate sale people. But he'd wanted to go through his father's study himself one last time, see if there was anything worth keeping. Any final connection to a man he'd never quite understood. The study was exactly as his father had left it 30 years ago. Frozen in time, books on the shelves, desk covered in dust, old typewriter in the corner, photographs on the walls of a younger, stronger man in better times. Clint had started with the desk drawers, found bills paid decades ago, old letters from relatives long dead, warranties for appliances that had been thrown away years ago. Nothing significant, nothing that mattered. Then he'd moved to the bookshelf. His father had loved books, read voraciously, despite limited formal education, self-taught in so many ways. The books were old, worn, some falling apart. Clint had pulled one down, a collection of Hemingway short stories, his father's favorite, and the envelope had fallen out, tumbled to the floor, yellowed, fragile, his name written in his father's distinctive slanted handwriting. His heart had stopped, because he knew that handwriting, knew it was from before the cancer ravaged his father's hands, before the end. This was written when his father was still himself. Clint had picked up the envelope with shaking hands. The seal was still intact, never opened, dated 3 days before his father's death, hidden in this book for 30 years, waiting. He'd sat down on the floor, right there, couldn't stand, couldn't move to a chair, just sat, stared at the envelope, tried to prepare himself for whatever was inside. Opening the letter took courage, because Clint had no idea what his father had written. The paper inside was also yellowed, fragile, his father's handwriting shakier than usual, but still legible, dated exactly as the envelope indicated. 3 days before death, written from the hospital, in private, when no one was watching, when death was close enough to make honesty necessary.
Clint read, and with each word felt something inside him crack open.
Son, I'm writing this because I can't say it to your face. Never could. My father couldn't say it to me either. We're men from a generation that showed love through work, not words. But I'm dying now, and I realize that's a coward's way. So here are the words I should have said years ago. You were right. About Hollywood, about acting, about everything. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And I was too proud to admit it. Watching you succeed should have filled me with joy, should have made me burst with pride. And it did. God, it did. But I couldn't show it, couldn't say it, because that would mean admitting I'd been wrong about you, wrong about your dreams, wrong about what you were capable of. Every time I saw you on screen, I wanted to call everyone I knew and say, that's my son, that's my boy. But I'd already drawn the line between us, already told you not to come crawling back. How could I celebrate your success without admitting my failure as a father? So I stayed silent, kept the wall up, pretended your success didn't matter to me. And in doing that, I robbed both of us of something precious. I robbed you of knowing that your father was proud. And I robbed myself of the joy of telling you. I know you tried, especially these last months, tried to talk, tried to bridge the gap. I saw it, I felt it, but I was too weak, too sick, too ashamed. How do you apologize for decades of silence? How do you say I'm proud of you when you should have been saying it all along? So I'm writing it, hoping you find this someday, hoping it's not too late to matter. I'm proud of you, son. Proud of everything you've accomplished. Proud of the man you became despite my failures. You proved me wrong about everything, and you were gracious enough never to rub it in my face. That takes a bigger man than I ever was. I wish I had been different. Wish I had been the father you deserved, instead of the father I was capable of being. Wish I had told you I loved you instead of showing it through silence and provision and the emotional distance my own father taught me. But I didn't, and now I'm dying, and all I have left is this letter and the hope that somehow, someday, you'll find it and know the truth. I love you. I always did. Even when I couldn't say it. Even when I couldn't show it. Even when I pushed you away instead of pulling you close. You were my son, my boy, my pride, and I failed you by never telling you. I'm sorry for all of it, for the coldness, for the silence, for letting pride matter more than love, for dying without saying what needed to be said. If there's an afterlife, I hope I get the chance to tell you this in person, to look you in the eye and say the words, but if not, I hope this letter finds you. Hope it brings you some peace, some closure, some understanding that my failure to show love wasn't your fault. It was mine. You deserved better. You deserved a father who could express what he felt, who could celebrate your victories, who could hug you and tell you he loved you without shame or reservation. I'm sorry I couldn't be that man. that I want you to know I see you. I've always seen you, and everything I see makes me proud. Your father. Clint finished reading and sat in absolute silence, the letter shaking in his hands. Destroyed was the only word for what Clint felt. Completely, utterly destroyed. Not from cruelty, from loss, from the realization of what had been there all along, hidden, unspoken, locked away. His father had been proud, had loved him, had seen everything, had known he was wrong, had wanted to say it, had wanted to bridge the gap, but couldn't, wouldn't, didn't know how. And Clint had spent 30 years believing the opposite, believing his father had died disappointed, died thinking his son had wasted his life, died without pride or love or recognition. 30 years of carrying that weight, of success feeling hollow because the one person he'd wanted to impress never acknowledged it, of holidays and visits feeling empty because the words were never said, of grief complicated by regret and unresolved pain, and it had all been wrong. His father had felt everything Clint had needed him to feel, had just been unable to say it, had been trapped by pride and generation and the patterns learned from his own father. The letter had been written, but hidden, placed in a book instead of given directly, as if even in writing, his father couldn't quite cross the final bridge, couldn't hand it over, could only hope it would be found someday. And it had been 30 years too late. Clint sat on that dusty floor and wept. Deep, wrenching sobs. 94 years old, crying like a child, crying for the father he'd lost, for the relationship they'd never had, for the words that came too late, for the pride that had been there all along but never shared. He cried for his father, too, for the pain the old man must have felt, writing those words but unable to speak them, knowing he was dying with things unsaid, hoping a hidden letter would somehow fix what a lifetime of silence had broken. How lonely his father must have been, how trapped, how desperate, writing a confession and apology to a son he couldn't face, hiding it in a book like a message in a bottle, hoping it would wash up on the right shore someday. After the tears, Clint did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He talked to his father, out loud, in that empty study, speaking to a ghost, speaking to a memory, speaking to the man who'd written the letter 30 years ago. "I wish you'd given this to me," Clint said. "I wish you'd handed it to me in the hospital, or told me where it was, or found some way to make sure I got it before you died." He paused, wiped his eyes, held the letter like it was the most precious thing in the world, which it was. "But I understand why you didn't. I get it now. You were just like me, proud, stubborn, waiting for the other person to make the first move. Both of us too damaged to bridge the gap." Clint looked at the photographs on the wall. His father, young, strong, before life and work and disappointment wore him down. "I needed to hear this," he said. "God, I needed it, but I think maybe I needed to find it now, at 94, near the end of my own life, because now I understand what you couldn't do. I understand the weight of pride, the fear of vulnerability, the pattern of silence passed from father to son." He thought about his own children, his relationships with them. Had he been the father his father couldn't be? Or had he repeated the same mistakes, different details, but same core problem? Work instead of words, provision instead of presence, success instead of connection. "I forgive you," Clint said, "for all of it. The silence, the distance, the years we wasted. I forgive you because I understand now. You loved me the best you could. You showed it the only way you knew, and when you finally found the words, you wrote them down. That took courage even if you couldn't take the final step." He folded the letter carefully, reverently. This was his father's voice, his father's heart, the thing he'd been searching for his entire life. "I love you too, Dad. Always did. Even when I thought you didn't love me. Even when I thought I'd disappointed you. Even when I thought your silence was judgment. I loved you. And I'm sorry we never figured out how to say it to each other while you were alive." The conversation, one-sided as it was, brought something like peace. Not complete, not perfect, but real. The letter had opened a wound that had been festering for 30 years, had exposed it to air and light, and now maybe it could finally heal. Clint kept the letter and did 3 things he'd never thought he'd do. First he called his children, all of them, one by one, and he told them something he'd never said clearly before. I'm proud of you. I love you. And I need to say that out loud because my father never said it to me, and I found out 30 years too late that he'd felt it all along. I don't want you to wait 30 years to know how I feel. Some of them cried, some thanked him, some said, I know, Dad. But they all heard it directly, clearly. No room for doubt or misunderstanding or wondering. Second, he had the letter framed, hung it in his study where he could see it, where it would remind him every day that love unexpressed is love wasted, that pride is a poor substitute for connection, that silence is its own kind of cruelty even when it's not intended to be. Third, he wrote his own letter, to his children, to his grandchildren, to anyone who would read it after he was gone. Not a hidden letter, not a secret confession, but an open declaration. He wrote about love, about regret, about the patterns families passed down, generation to generation, about how his father's silence taught him silence, and how finding that letter taught him something different. He wrote about the importance of saying what you feel while there's still time, about not assuming people know, about not letting pride or fear or generational patterns keep you from expressing what matters. And he made copies, gave them to his children while he was still alive, made sure they knew, made sure there would be no hidden letters for them to find decades later, no yellowed confessions discovered too late. The letter from his father changed Clint's last years, not by erasing the past, but by helping him understand it, by giving him the closure he'd needed for 3 decades, by letting him grieve properly finally, not grieving what wasn't there, but grieving what was always there, but never shared. He learned that his father's silence wasn't judgment. It was fear, fear of vulnerability, fear of admitting fault, fear of crossing bridges that pride had burned. He learned that love can exist without words, but it's so much harder, so much more painful, so much more likely to be misunderstood. Words matter. Expression matters. Saying it out loud matters. He learned that finding the letter 30 years later was both devastating and necessary. Devastating because of all the wasted time, all the misunderstandings, all the pain that could have been avoided, but necessary because at 94 he could understand his father's limitations in a way he couldn't have at 64. Age brings empathy. Experience brings understanding, and being close to death himself helped Clint understand why his father had hidden the letter instead of giving it directly. Sometimes the final bridge is too far, too exposed, too terrifying. So you build a smaller bridge and hope it's found. In his last years, Clint became a different kind of father, a different kind of grandfather. Not perfect, but present, not silent, but expressive, not waiting for others to guess what he felt, but telling them directly. He started ending every phone call with, I love you, even when it felt awkward, especially when it felt awkward, because awkward spoken love is better than eloquent unspoken love. He started writing letters to his grandchildren, not to be found after death, but to be read now, while he was alive, while they could respond, while the words could create connection, instead of just closure. He started asking his children about their lives, really asking, really listening, not trying to fix or advise or judge, just being present, just being interested, just being what his father couldn't be. And when people asked about the change because it was noticeable, Clint would show them the letter, his father's final words written 3 days before death, hidden for 30 years, found by accident, devastating and healing in equal measure. This is why, he'd say. This is what happens when love goes unspoken, when pride matters more than connection, when we assume people know what we feel instead of telling them. We waste our lives. We waste our relationships. We waste our love. The letter hung in his study until the day Clint died. He looked at it every morning, a reminder, a wound, a gift, a tragedy, a hope. His father had written, I wish I had been different. And Clint had become different. Not perfectly, but intentionally, using his father's regret as a roadmap for what not to do, using his father's hidden words as motivation to speak his own words openly. When Clint died at 97, There were no hidden letters, no secret confessions waiting to be found, no children wondering if he'd been proud, no grandchildren questioning if they'd mattered, because he'd said it out loud, repeatedly, while there was still time. At his funeral, his daughter read the letter he'd written to them years before, the one inspired by finding his father's hidden confession, the one about love and regret and speaking truth while you can. And she read his father's letter, too, the one that had been hidden for 30 years, the one that destroyed Clint when he found it, but also saved him, also freed him, also taught him the most important lesson of his life. Love unexpressed is love wasted. Words unsaid are opportunities lost. And pride is a poor substitute for connection. 2 letters, 2 generations, 2 men who loved but couldn't say it until it was almost too late. One found 30 years after death and changed everything. The other given openly during life and created the connection both had always wanted. The difference between them? Courage. Courage to speak. Courage to be vulnerable. Courage to risk rejection in pursuit of connection. Clint's father had found that courage 3 days before death and hidden it in a book. Clint found that courage after reading the letter and lived it openly. The letter said, "I'm proud of you, son." And Clint made sure his children heard it directly while he was alive, while it could still create joy instead of just relief, while the words could build bridges instead of just closing wounds. That was the gift. Hidden for 30 years, devastating when found, but ultimately transformative. A father's last words, discovered too late to respond to, but just in time to change everything about how his son lived the years he had left.